I said at the beginning of this week's lectures that this era is basically divided up into the period before Elvis, and we talked about that, 1955, we talked about Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Little Richard, Bill Haley, people like that. And then Elvis, which we've just gotten done talking about, and the importance of him, especially when he comes onto the scene in 1956 when he signs with RCA and they put all of their promotional muscle behind him, and he starts to have all this fantastic national success on all three charts. And then there's the period after Elvis, or after Elvis's initial success, so now we're talking about 57, 58, and 59. And that's what we're going to talk about now, the artists who were important during that third division of years that we're talking about in this relatively short period from 55 through 59 or 60. Let's stay with Sun Records for a minute and talk about some of the artists who were still at Sun after Elvis departed. The first of these is Carl Perkins, a singing guitar player who had a pretty good hit, a #2 hit with Blue Suede Shoes. In fact, even before Elvis did it, Carl Perkins had a record that was a hit on all three charts at the same time. But unfortunately for Carl Perkins, on his way to a television performance on the East Coast to promote Blue Suede Shoes, they were in a car accident. And nobody was killed, but as I recall, I think he busted a leg or something like that, and so couldn't perform for 4 to 6 weeks. So just when the song would have crested, maybe he could have put himself in a position to be a bigger star, he was laid up in the hospital and out of it for a month or two, and so that was really a sort of a bad turn of events for him. Interestingly, Carl Perkins was one of the favorite artists for the Beatles to cover later, and George Harrison was such a fan of Carl Perkins that when all the other guys early on in the band, when they changed their names to have stage names, Paul was Paul Ramon and John Lennon was Long John Lennon, George Harrison changed his name to Carl Harrison. Not exactly a dramatic change, but anyway, kind of cute and fun. Carl Perkins. Another one that was at Sun after Elvis, Johnny Cash, had a country and western hit in 1956 with Folsom Prison Blues, a song that we all think of now as a classic country hit. And then I Walk the Line in 1956 was on Sun Records, which was a country western pop crossover. That's something we haven't talked about yet. The idea that a song could be a hit first on the country western charts and then cross over onto the pop charts. Last week, we talked about New San Antonio Rose, which had originally been a hit for Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys, and then when covered by Bing Crosby, became a hit on the pop charts. But here, the actual Johnny Cash record moved over from country to pop. And then finally, maybe the biggest name and most successful name, at least for these years, after Elvis, is Jerry Lee Lewis, whose Whole Lot of Shakin' Going On was a big hit in 1957, Great Balls of Fire in 1957. After that, it was Breathless. I mean, Jerry Lee Lewis was in many ways very much like Little Richard, a pianist who sang and who was had a wild kind of act, although his was a little bit more sort of, Southern white Louisiana as opposed to Richard's. But he was a fantastic performer, very charismatic. One other person that we should mention who was on Sun, and we'll talk about him next week, is Roy Orbison, who was here about this time. Now, in the case of Johnny Cash and Roy Orbison, they both went on to have their greatest successes after they left Sun Records. But you can kind of see, with all of these people going through the Sun Studios in Memphis, a small little independent label, there was an awful lot of talented people coming through Sun Records. Some of the other, what we call rockabilly artists, we talk about this southern style out of Sun Records that Elvis and the rest of these artists were involved in, is rockabilly, the cross between hillbilly music and rock music, rockabilly. Maybe the most famous later exponent of rockabilly would be somebody like Brian Setzer, who still continues to record in the rockabilly style. Anyway, some important other rockabillys, Gene Vincent, whose Bebop-A-Lula was a hit on the Capitol label out of Los Angeles in 1956. Gene Vincent was signed by Capitol in the wake of Elvis to be their version of Elvis Presley. When once RCA had one, everybody had to have one. Eddie Cochran was signed by Liberty out of Los Angeles and had a hit with 20 Flight Rock in 1956 and Summertime Blues in 1958. Interestingly, those Eddie Cochran records were recorded in Gold Star Studios in Los Angeles, which would later, we'll talk about this next week, be a very important studio for Phil Spector and those Wall of Sound recordings. Both Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran perform in a movie called The Girl Can't Help It. from 1956, which is sort of an upscale version of those Alan Freed movies I was talking about a couple of lectures ago, because there actually are real movie stars and there actually is a real story. This movie, The Girl Can't Help It, was a kind of a hit movie of the day, and Paul McCartney often talks about how influential that movie was and the performances in it, especially the Eddie Cochran performance of 20 Flight Rock. In many ways, Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent were probably more influential in the UK, and that may be because they were so available to UK music fans through that film. Anyway, both of them had really big success in the UK, maybe bigger than they had in the United States. Now, right in this part of the course, we probably should talk about Ricky Nelson and the Everly Brothers in this period at the end of the 50s as other important rockabilly stars. But I'm going to save discussion of them for next week when we talk about music in the period between 1960 and 1963, because both Ricky Nelson and the Everly Brothers went on to have a lot of success sort of into that era. And so we'll save discussion of those. We'll double back and pick up on those guys when we get to that point. Let's talk a little bit about something I call rockabilly ladies. One of the things, we have to remember that when rock and roll was unfolding, people were trying various kinds of things. And one thing they thought is, well, you know, if there can be a rockabilly Elvis, why not a female Elvis? That could maybe be something that we could sort of sell some records. And so Janice Martin actually was signed to RCA just weeks after Elvis Presley was signed to RCA to be kind of the Elvis, female Elvis. And so she had a single that came out called Drugstore Rock from 1956, so that gets kind of into the teen life. You know, go to the drugstore, the soda fountain there. But then she had a song called My Boy Elvis from 1956. Wanda Jackson had a tune, a bunch of sort of rockabilly tunes from that era, maybe the biggest one at the very end of this era called Let's Have a Party from 1960. She knew Elvis Presley personally, and he sort of talked Wanda Jackson into doing this sort of female rockabilly thing. But maybe the most interesting historically is Brenda Lee. Now, Brenda Lee went on to have tremendous success in the 1960s. Her song I'm Sorry was a fantastic country western hit and crossover. But when she was just 12 years old, in 1956, she was called Little Brenda Lee and recorded a tune called Bigelow 6 2000 that was markedly a female rockabilly tune. Now, these female rockabillys are now sort of a bit of a kind of footnote to the history, but it sort of shows you that the people in the industry didn't quite know what they were, they didn't know what they were doing, but they didn't know what would catch on, and so they tried a couple of different things, and this is one that probably didn't catch on so much, certainly didn't catch on like Elvis did. Well, the last figure I want to talk about in this lecture is Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly is a very important figure in this period, but comes at it pretty late in the game. In fact, Buddy Holly is somebody who also was signed in the wake of Elvis going to RCA as a major label's version of Elvis, and that label was Decca. But let's say a little bit about Buddy and his background. Buddy, I think as most people know, comes from Lubbock, Texas. And as I said, signed to Decca in the wake of Elvis's RCA deal, but that initial signing with Decca went absolutely nowhere. They took Buddy off. I forget where they did the recording. Maybe it was in New York, and they did some recording, and nothing came of it. And so he went back to Lubbock. And back in Lubbock, he caught the attention of a producer, well, a guy who had some records on the chart himself, Norman Petty, who had his own recording studio in Clovis, New Mexico, who was kind of becoming a record producer, not unlike Sam Phillips at about the same time. He has great equipment, some great ideas, was a very forward-looking kind of guy. So Buddy Holly and his guys used to go to Clovis, New Mexico to record almost everything they did. So almost all of those recordings that you know, the classic Buddy Holly recordings, were all recorded in Clovis, New Mexico and engineered by and produced by Norman Petty. There's a time difference of 1 hour between Lubbock and Clovis, and so the Buddy Holly and his buddies, and I think the distance between the two is about 100 miles. You can check on a map and see, but the story is that long stretch of flat highway. The band used to like to leave Texas and try to arrive in Clovis before they left Texas. So that meant sometimes having to do 70 or 80 miles an hour, maybe 90 or 100, depending on what the distance is there. That gives you some idea of the wide open spaces of what we're talking about here. Well, with those recordings from Clovis, New Mexico, they got interest in two labels. Well, one label first, Coral, who ironically were a subsidiary of Decca. So Decca wasn't holding anything against Buddy Holly for the first one not working out. But what they decided was an interesting kind of promotional trick. They decided that some of the records would be released as Buddy Holly on the Decca subsidiary Coral, and some of the others would be released as the Crickets on the Decca subsidiary Brunswick. I guess the idea is that you could have one artist being two different bands and on two different labels and be able to maybe have more chance of getting onto the charts or getting more records into radio play and that kind of thing. And so anyway, that's what happened. So if you really want to get picky about it, the tunes that we really think of as being Buddy Holly tunes, some of them were Buddy Holly tunes, some tunes, strictly speaking, were Crickets tunes, although now in all anthologies they're basically thought of, as Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Same guys, same studio, same everything on most of them. Again, an important songwriter along with Chuck Berry, one of the important early songwriters, the Beatles, of course, and others, Bob Dylan, a lot of other 60s musicians were very much influenced by Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry. Some of the big representative examples of the Buddy Holly style, Peggy Sue from 1957, Oh Boy from 1957, Maybe Baby from 1958. Buddy Holly was much covered by other artists, so we've got the Beatles doing Words of Love, the Rolling Stones doing Don't Fade Away, Linda Ronstadt doing It's So Easy, and lots of others later. Buddy unfortunately died early in a plane crash. It was February the 3rd, 1959. I think he was only 22 years old when he died. Don McLean, later in 1971, in a song called American Pie, talked about that as the day the music died. The idea that rock and roll and its original incarnation, this era that we're talking about from 55 up to this point, basically died the day that Buddy Holly went down in that plane. And so what we want to do is in the next segment talk about what happened at the end of this period in 1959. But at this point, rock and roll, it turns out, was in certain kind of trouble. There had been a lot of pressure that rock and roll was a negative influence, and this pressure was really starting to threaten the possibility of rock and roll continue. So in the next video, let's find out what happened at the end of the decade when rock and roll was in such trouble.